guys, what's going on? It's the 2026 Japanese Grand Prix weekend recap. We're going to talk about everything that happened over the weekend, the good, the bad, the ugly. We're going to talk about our weekend quick hits. We're going to go over our weekend winners and losers, and then we'll wrap things up talking about our predictions that we made before the weekend began, our 3 lingering questions, and then we'll take a look ahead at what is next in Formula One. Without further ado, let's not beat around the bush. Let's go ahead and jump on into this thing with our weekend quick hits. Honestly, not too many quick hits for this weekend. It really was a very interesting weekend that really concentrated in on only a handful of things. But obviously, we have to start with our race winner, Kimi Antonelli, who becomes officially the youngest championship leader in Formula One history. I think I saw that he's the first teenager to lead the World Championship. So obviously, Kimi Antonelli taking pole position on Saturday converts that into a win on Sunday, and he now leads the championship over his teammate George Russell for the first time in his career. It was a fantastic weekend for Kimi Antonelli outside of his start, and obviously I think he did have to get lucky. Well, I'm not going to say he had to get lucky with the safety car, but the safety car definitely helped him out. But regardless, he absolutely deserves a win, and he definitely deserves to be leading the championship at this point. Takes the win in China for his first F1 victory and backs it up by going back-to-back and taking another win in Japan as we now head towards a nice long break for him to enjoy leading the World Championship. So definitely deserved, and definitely congratulations to Kimi on his back-to-back victories in Formula One. But that said, I think the driver of the weekend has to be Oscar Piastri, who finally gets to have his Grand Prix season debut. Finally, after crashing out in Australia and not even making it to the grid in China, not only does Oscar Piastri complete a Grand Prix, an achievement in itself, some might say, he absolutely has a fantastic weekend. Gets a great launch, a decent qualifying, a decent launch, and the race ends up actually, put it there, he led the race for, well, it was like 17, 18 laps or something like that. And so what a way for him to start his season, realistically. Without the safety car, I think it would have been extremely interesting to see what he could have done. He was leading the race. It really didn't seem like George Russell was able to make much inroads on him. And so this one might be one of those what-if moments in Formula One where you look at it and go, could Oscar Piastri have won? I don't know. But he definitely deserved his second place, first podium of the season, because he was rapid all weekend and he earned it more so than it was given it. And so congratulations, Oscar, a big weekend for you. Let's move on now to George Russell, who probably was the most put out by the safety car. Obviously, George got the better of the start of the two McLarens. Kimi Antonelli found himself back in 6th. But when it was all said and done, George Russell found himself in 4th. Now, not many of us, I think, were really expecting him to struggle as much as he did to sort of attack Oscar in the beginning. Ultimately, McLaren decided to pit Oscar early and try and cover off the rest of the field. Ultimately, I think would have been a fantastic strategy. Not only that, we saw when the safety car came out, George Russell had just pitted himself, giving Kimi Antonelli the on-track lead. But it was a very interesting thing to follow even after that. Kimi Antonelli, with the clear air ahead of him, was able to basically just drive off into the distance. But George Russell really struggled in the pack, fighting with, Charles Leclerc, Lando Norris, Lewis Hamilton. The 4 of them really were struggling against each other. And George, I think, is probably the most surprising there. We've obviously seen the pace that Mercedes has over a single lap, and in clear air, it definitely has a pace advantage over the rest of the grid. But it might be slightly susceptible to running in the pack. It's something definitely to keep an eye on here, especially if Mercedes is going to continue to have these poor starts and not lead into turn 1s like we've seen so far, basically every single race this year. So going to be something to follow. But George Russell now, I'm sure after Australia and the Chinese sprint race, thought he had a sizable advantage in this championship, now finds himself behind his, I almost said rookie teammate, but behind his young teammates, and might be wondering where exactly that advantage went. Okay, I think the next 2 points, the final 2 points really, I think we're going to merge into one. We're going to be talking about these regulations because I think Japan was the first weekend where we really saw the limitations of what these regulations realistically look like, as well as how dangerous they can be. I wanted to talk about the regulations in terms of what we saw on a lap around Suzuka, and then I want to talk about the dangers of these, obviously, like we saw with Ollie Behrman and Franco Colapinto and their incidents that they had going towards Spoon Curve. This was a weekend where a lot of us got to see the actual limitations that probably weren't as prevalent in Australia or China. For whatever reason, even in China, the teams managed to figure something out with that long straight. But there was something about that run out of Spoon towards 130R and then towards the final chicane that really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Obviously, downshifting through 130R, basically losing between 50 and 80 kilometers an hour, depending on the car in the instance, down towards that, basically the effective final corner. It was a bit tough to see. And then you have the dangerous side of them as well with the Franco Colapinto, Ollie Behrman incident. I still can't wrap my head around exactly what happened. That all we know is that there was a somewhere between 50 and 80 kilometer an hour difference between Colapinto, who was harvesting ahead, and Ollie Behrman, who was charging through the field once again on some pressure tires. There was a massive speed difference between the two. Ollie Behrman, a bit shaken up by Franco Colapinto, sort of just drifting towards the middle of the road. Had to make evasive maneuvers and ended up in the barrier in a 50G crash, broadside, effectively. And so we saw him visibly shaken up and limping after the incident when he got out of the car. Thankfully, he had an x-ray done and there were no fractures, and I think he was just a right knee contusion as of right now. So thankfully, he seems to have avoided a lot of the potential worst case scenarios of that crash, but boy, oh boy, is this one got the entire internet and grid in arms, and it'll be very interesting to see what the FIA does about this. They've already made it very clear that they're not going to make any harsh, drastic changes to these regulations. We had a little minor one going into the weekend for qualifying. We saw how non-effective those were, basically. And so this is something that we're going to have to keep an eye on, because I think realistically, this might have been one of the more better case scenarios if a crash or an incident like this was going to happen. Imagine if this was like at a Baku or Singapore, where the walls are close, and that could have been a whole heck of a lot worse. So definitely something to monitor. I'm super happy that Ollie is okay. Obviously, as a Haas fan, you never want to see a driver get hurt like that in general. But as a Haas fan, I've seen the start that he had to the season, and I want nothing less than to see him be injured and have to get, obviously miss time or just be injured in general. And so it is definitely something to keep an eye on. And I think that definitely was a very, very pervasive commentary throughout the rest of the weekend after that safety car and that incident came out. So something to keep an eye on, but holistically, it was a tough look for not only the Japan race, but these regs as a whole, because not a whole lot of people seem very enthusiastic about them after that. All right, let's quickly move on. We'll talk our weekend winners and losers. I've basically already covered a lot of these, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Let's go ahead and begin with our weekend winner, and I'm going with Oscar Piastri to finally get your 2026 season started in about as good a possible way as you could. Obviously, 2 DNSs on the cards. He finally gets to turn a Grand Prix lap, and not only that, he leads the Japanese Grand Prix for a dozen or so laps, and without the safety car, you have to imagine was on the pace to potentially at least challenge for the win. Obviously, after the safety car, there wasn't a whole lot he could do against Antonelli on fresh tires in clear air. But at the same time, it was a fantastic weekend for Oscar, who now got himself a great start to his season. Finally, 3 rounds in. As we take a look at our pick for weekend loser, I'm going with Ollie Behrman this week, mainly because he took the brunt of a 50G crash, basically to the side, and managed to somehow walk away relatively uninjured. Obviously, a right knee contusion and anything that might linger, or sort of, the soreness from after that, even if he's not officially injured, the soreness surely will not be something that you're looking forward to. I'm really relieved that he now gets a month or 5 weeks almost off to sort of rest and recover. He mentioned that he's going to take a handful of days off to rest and recover. So thankfully, hopefully everything is okay with him. These regulations and that Franco Colapinto just sort of lazily moving into Ollie's path was extremely dangerous. And the fact that this was the outcome, I'm not even going to say this was the outcome, but just that this was the outcome ultimately. It could have been a lot worse. I shudder to think what would have happened if Ollie hadn't bailed onto the grass and done that, because obviously that's a plane crash if he goes into the back of Franco Colapinto. So all in all, I think there were other people who might, in terms of the sport as a whole, might be a bigger loser. But ultimately, I think Ollie Bearman is the easy pick for weekend loser here, because boy, oh boy, that was a big one. All right, let's go ahead and run through a pretty solid weekend of predictions for me. We actually, regardless of everything that happened in the podium and the qualifying, I actually managed to cook here a little bit. Let's go ahead and begin with my biggest positive surprise. I went with Esteban Ocon, who actually seemed to have a bit of pace over teammate Ollie Bearman. Ultimately, we were not sure if this is actually down to just pure pace, or if Ollie's car was having some software or deployment issues all weekend. Either way, he did qualify ahead of Ollie and actually finished in the points, both of which I called. And so I'll be taking the point there as we get off to a pretty solid start to our weekend of predictions. As we move on now to my pick for biggest disappointment, I went with Carlos Sainz, who managed to finish P9 in China. And I think this one was pretty much I expected both McLarens to take part. I expected a little less unreliability from some of those top teams. And ultimately, I think this is going to be a weekend where Williams would probably just naturally filter back down to where they realistically would. And obviously, that did end up occurring. Carlos did not have the pace to sort of challenge really at all this weekend. We saw Williams sort of miring around the bottom half of the grid pretty unremarkably. And so I'll take the point for that one as well. 2 for 2 so far. As we move on now to qualifying top 3, I went for a George Russell pole position, a Kimi Antonelli P2, and a Charles Leclerc P3. A pretty straightforward prediction from me, as ultimately not entirely true. George Russell and Kimi Antonelli ended up flopped, so I get a half point each for those. And Charles Leclerc actually lost out to Oscar Piastri. And so ultimately only a half point a couple of times equals 1 point. So while I'm glad to get a singular point in total, it was the first misstep of my predictions weekend. As we move on now to my race podium, I have a George Russell win, a Kimi Antonelli P2, and a Lewis Hamilton P3. I think that Lewis seems to have a bit more race pace than quali pace, and for a brief moment, it looked like Lewis would be able to challenge for a podium, but ultimately by the end, not sure entirely what happened, but he ended up falling down the order. George Russell got caught out by the safety car. He ended up only, P4 in the end, so not even on the podium. And ultimately, it was only Kimi Antonelli of these 3 drivers who finished not only on the podium, but took the win. And so a singular half point for me there. As we go on, and let's wrap things up with our one crazy prediction. I went for Haas remain above Red Bull in the standings. And, and they keep their spot. So they were P4 before the weekend began. And thanks to Esteban Ocon's singular point, they do maintain P4 in the constructors. And not only are we ahead of Red Bull actually ended up dropping behind Alpine. So ding, 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 Haas remain P4 in the constructors. I was unsure if this one was going to come true after qualifying, and especially sure after Ollie's crash. But at the same time, Esteban had his best weekend. He clutched up for me, and I take the point there. So if we take a look now at our predictions standings for the community, I regain the lead in the community with 11.5 points. F1 Inferno just behind on 10.5 points. British TTG now on 9 points, just a bit behind. Spectral returns this week for 4.5 points, and unfortunately, Senel did not get their predictions in this week, so he remains on 2 points. It was a fun weekend for predictions, and I can't wait. Well, I guess I have to wait. But the real question is, what questions do we have remaining? 3 lingering questions for Formula One. The first one of which I sort of addressed a little bit is, will F1 address how dangerous these regulations can be? And I think at this point we've seen it at least a little bit. They've touched on, obviously, how they don't want to make drastic changes, but at the end of the day, this was a massive incident, and there are a lot of massively problematic tracks on the calendar that this could ultimately be a very dangerous precedent to set. So very curious to see if they address it over this 5 weeks, and if so, what they bring to the table. But time will tell for that one. Second question I have is, which teams will utilize the impromptu spring break the most? Obviously, I think Mercedes is still comfortably out in front, but this weekend did at least show Ferrari that they are not quite as clear for second position in terms of best car. And so I think Ferrari and McLaren are going to be extremely interesting to follow this break and see what they can bring in Miami. Then you have the midfield teams like Alpine, Red Bull, Haas, and VCAR, who sort of are looking to try and secure themselves the best of the rest spot. Alpine and Pierre Gasly have obviously been on a roll. Ollie Behrman, outside of Japan, has been on a fantastic run. And it's been a very interesting midfield fight. Red Bull, I think, is probably the ones who are the most on the back foot, mainly just from a expectations versus reality standpoint. So I'm sure they're more than eager to get back on the right side of that best of the rest position and potentially try and make it a top 4 again instead of the top 3 that it really seems to be. And then finally, my last lingering question is, will McLaren start to factor into the fight for P2 in the constructors? Obviously, they're a bit behind the 8 ball here, obviously having a DNS from Oscar Piastri in Australia and a double DNS in China. But if they're able to put in the pace that we saw in Japan over the course of an entire season, I think they'll absolutely get involved. Obviously, Ferrari, I think, felt pretty comfortable in terms of being the second best car. We might have all gotten a little bit over our head in China with obviously neither McLaren taking part. But at the end of the day, we go to Japan now, and Oscar Piastri seems pretty comfortable in that car, and I think it'll make a big difference, especially down the course of the season. So this 5-week break is going to be very, very interesting, to say the least. But that leaves only one final question remaining. What is next in Formula One? We have to wait a whole 5 weeks, thanks to the cancellation of the Bahrain and Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Wholly and fully justified, by the way. This is going to be a long break, and realistically, it's going to be a long, extra long break, because after Miami, it'll be another, I think, 3 weeks after Miami. And so we have one race in basically the next 2 months to enjoy. So enjoy some time off, and let's try and find some way to pass the time. But realistically, even though it is a month, last year we did see a Piastri, Norris, a Russell podium in the Grand Prix. Who will we see on the podium this year? But guys, we have like I mentioned, a very long wait here as we count down the days, hours, minutes, seconds before the Miami Grand Prix. But here we are, and we get to wait no matter basically whether we like it or not. If you made it this far into the video, I truly, truly appreciate you. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a like on the video because it really helps me out. And leave a comment down below giving me your rating for the 2026 Japanese Grand Prix. We'll be back with some F1 related videos over this short break. We got to talk about F1 somehow. But guys, that was our 2026 Japanese race review. It was an interesting race for sure, and I hope I got my feelings about it across in a good way. But guys, that'll wrap it up for us here in this one, and I'll see you in the next one.